The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and something metallic I couldn't quite place at first. Later, I realized it was blood. Mine. The air was too cold, pressing against my skin the way the floor would moments later. I lay there barely 3 days out of surgery, my body still heavy and uncooperative, every breath a negotiation. Machines hummed beside me, steady and indifferent, as if nothing in the world could go wrong inside a place designed to save lives. Then the door flew open. He didn't knock. He never did. My stepdad's footsteps were loud, impatient, the sound of a man who believed every space he entered already belonged to him. He stood at the foot of my bed, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes scanning me, not with concern, but calculation. "You better start earning your keep," he yelled, his voice filling the room, bouncing off the pale walls. "I'm not paying for you to lie around pretending you're helpless." I tried to speak. I really did. But my throat was dry, my tongue thick, my body slow. I told him the doctor said I couldn't work yet. I told him I was still healing. I told him I wasn't pretending. That's when his hand came down. I never saw it coming. 1 second I was gripping the edge of the mattress, the next the world tilted violently sideways. I slid off the bed and hit the hospital floor hard. Cold tiles slammed into my shoulder, my cheek, my hip. Pain exploded through my abdomen, sharper than the surgery itself. My mouth filled with the unmistakable taste of metal. Blood. My hands started shaking, not from fear at first, but from shock. He loomed over me, barking, "Stop pretending you're weak." As I lay there stunned and bleeding on the hospital floor, one thought cut through everything else with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just anger. This felt planned, and whatever he was preparing for the slap was only the beginning. Nurses rushed in almost immediately. Shoes squeaked. Voices overlapped. Someone called my name. I felt hands on my arms, gentle but firm, lifting me back onto the bed. Someone pressed gauze to my mouth. Someone else checked my incision, asking if I felt dizzy, if I could breathe. The machines beside me started beeping faster, reacting to my heart racing out of control. My stepdad stepped back, his expression shifting with impressive speed. The rage drained from his face, replaced by something calmer, almost bored. He raised his hands slightly, palms out the universal gesture of innocence. "She's dramatic," he said to the nurses. "Always has been. She works herself up over nothing." I wanted to scream. I wanted to point at the blood, the bruise already blooming on my cheek, the fact that I'd been on the floor of a hospital room. But my voice felt trapped somewhere deep inside me, pressed down by exhaustion and disbelief. My mother stood near the window. She hadn't moved. Not when he yelled, not when he hit me, not when I fell. She stared at the floor, her shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped together like she was praying for this to end quickly. When one of the nurses looked at her, clearly expecting something, an explanation, a protest, anything, my mother finally spoke. "He's just under a lot of stress," she said softly. "The medical bills. It's been hard on him. Hard on him." The words settled over me heavier than the blanket they pulled up to my chest. I turned my head toward her, searching her face for something familiar, something maternal. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Security arrived. Then someone from administration. My stepdad was asked to step out, his tone indignant, offended by the suggestion that he'd done anything wrong. As they escorted him into the hallway, he shot me a look, not angry, not apologetic, measuring, like he was adjusting a plan. When the door finally closed, the room felt impossibly quiet. A nurse leaned close and told me I was safe now. I nodded because it seemed like the right response, even though I didn't believe it. My cheek throbbed, my stomach burned, my heart wouldn't slow down. I stared at the ceiling tiles and tried to understand how a place meant for healing had turned into another reminder that I was powerless. I was discharged the next morning. My mother picked me up alone. She talked about traffic, about the weather, about how relieved she was that I was finally going home. Not once did she mention what had happened. Not once did she ask if I was okay beyond the physical. I sat in the passenger seat holding my stitches, watching familiar streets pass by, and feeling like I was being returned to something far more dangerous than the hospital ever was. The house looked the same when we pulled into the driveway. Same faded paint, same crooked mailbox, same windows that reflected the sky like unblinking eyes. As soon as I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, as if it had been waiting for me. He was already there. My stepdad sat at the kitchen table, coffee mug in hand, reading the paper like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. He looked up when we entered, his expression neutral, almost pleasant. "You're home," he said. "Good. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a statement like he'd been expecting this exact moment." He stood and moved closer, stopping just far enough away to look reasonable. "We need to talk about how things are going to work from now on," he said calmly. "You can't just lie around forever." My mother busied herself with her purse, her coat, anything that wasn't me. I nodded. That surprised him. I could tell by the slight lift of his eyebrows, the way his shoulders relaxed just a fraction. He mistook my silence for submission. Everyone always did. I went to my room and closed the door. It didn't lock. It never had. I sat on the edge of the bed, every muscle screaming, and stared at my hands. They were still shaking, but slower now, more controlled. The bruise on my cheek throbbed in time with my heartbeat. That night I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards, the low murmur of the television, the clink of dishes being set down. Everything felt louder, sharper, like my senses had been tuned too high. I replayed the hospital room over and over in my head. The slap, the fall, the way he'd looked at me afterward. For the first time, I stopped asking myself why he did it. Instead, I asked myself what he thought would happen next. By morning, my body was exhausted, but my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. I realized something simple and terrifying. If he was willing to hit me in a hospital surrounded by witnesses, then there were no limits left, no line he wouldn't cross if he thought he could get away with it. And the worst part wasn't the pain or the humiliation. It was the certainty settling deep in my chest that whatever he was planning didn't end with me getting better. It ended with me disappearing from the picture entirely. As the sun came up and light crept through my window, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't plead. I wouldn't try to convince anyone of anything anymore. If he thought I was weak, I would let him. But I would be watching. I didn't sleep much after that first night home. The pain medication blurred the edges of things, but it also loosened memories I'd spent years pushing aside. Lying there in the dark, listening to the house breathe around me, I finally admitted something I'd been avoiding. What happened in the hospital wasn't an explosion. It was an escalation. And to understand it, I had to go back to the moment he first stepped into our lives wearing the costume of a savior. Before him, our house was small and strained, but it was honest. Money was always tight, but no one pretended otherwise. My mother and I shared the same worries out loud, usually late at night at the kitchen table, cups of cold tea between us. We were tired, grieving, and afraid of the future, but we faced it together. The house felt cluttered with bills and memories, yet it still felt like ours. My mother had been vulnerable then. Grief hollowed her out in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. She carried it quietly like a weight she refused to set down. I was doing what I could, helping around the house, working, when my body allowed trying not to become another problem she had to manage. We were surviving, not thriving, but we were surviving on our own terms. Then he appeared. He came into our lives smoothly, almost effortlessly, the way some people do when they sense an opening. He knew how to speak in complete sentences that sounded like solutions. He knew how to listen just long enough to identify what someone wanted most and then offer it back to them in polished words. Stability, security, relief. At first he was charming in a careful, deliberate way. He brought groceries without being asked, fixed things around the house before we realized they were broken. He spoke gently to my mother, called her strong, told her she'd carried too much on her own for too long. When he looked at me, his smile tightened slightly, like he was assessing a piece of furniture he hadn't decided where to place yet. I noticed things early, though I didn't know what to call them. The way he answered questions directed at my mother. The way he framed advice as concern. The way his generosity always came with an explanation of how difficult it had been for him to provide it. None of it felt overtly wrong, it just felt weighted. The shift happened so gradually that it's hard to pinpoint a single moment when the house stopped being ours and started being his. It began with suggestions, helpful ones, sensible ones, He offered to look over finances, said he had a head for numbers, and hated seeing my mother stressed. He talked about streamlining, about efficiency, about making life easier. My mother was exhausted. The relief on her face the first time she handed something over to him still sits heavy in my chest. It wasn't trust as much as surrender. She wanted the noise in her head to stop, and he promised he could quiet it. Soon decisions were being made before conversations happened. Accounts were combined temporarily. Bills were paid without explanation. Questions were met with reassurance instead of answers. Whenever I asked for specifics, he smiled and told me not to worry about adult problems. He said it kindly enough that I wondered if I was being sensitive. His language changed before his behavior did. He started using phrases like, "for your own good," and "we need to be smart about this." Independence became recklessness. Caution became negativity. If I hesitated, he framed it as fear. If I pushed back, he framed it as immaturity. My role in the house shifted quietly. I went from participant to observer, from contributor to burden, without ever being told directly. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Plans were made that included me only as an afterthought. When he joked at my expense, my mother laughed softly the way people do when they're trying to keep the peace. I remember the first time I felt truly outnumbered. It was over something small. A routine decision that somehow turned into a lecture about responsibility and contribution. He spoke calmly, logically, like a man explaining a lesson to a slow student. My mother nodded along, eyes down, agreeing with points she would have challenged a year earlier. I went to my room afterward and sat on the bed staring at the wall, trying to understand how I'd become the problem in my own home. The disrespect didn't arrive in a storm. It crept in like dampness seeping into corners until everything smelled faintly off. He commented on how much space I took up, on how much things cost, on how long my recovery periods lasted. Always measured, always reasonable, always leaving just enough room for doubt. The hardest part wasn't what he said. It was how quickly I started questioning myself. I replayed conversations, searched for moments where I might have misunderstood, wondered if I really was failing in ways I couldn't see. That doubt was his greatest tool, and he wielded it without raising his voice. The house itself changed, not physically but emotionally. Rules became unpredictable, tied to his mood, rather than any logic I could follow. Some days I was encouraged to rest. Other days I was criticized for not doing enough. Praise and disapproval followed no pattern I could learn. I began to anticipate his reactions, adjusting my behavior to minimize conflict shrinking without fully realizing it. My mother changed too. She grew quieter, smaller somehow, as if she were folding in on herself to fit into the space he allowed her. She stopped calling friends, stopped questioning timelines, stopped disagreeing. When I tried to talk to her privately, she brushed it off, told me I was imagining things, told me he meant well. The house stopped feeling like a place I could breathe. Looking back, I see how carefully it was done. No sudden takeovers, no dramatic ultimatums, just a steady redefinition of normal. By the time I realized how much ground I'd lost, I couldn't point to a single moment where I should have fought harder. That's why the hospital slap mattered so much. It stripped away the subtlety. It took everything he'd been doing quietly and slammed it into the open. Lying there in that bed, then on that floor, I finally saw the through line, the control, the entitlement, the certainty that no one would stop him. When the memory faded and the house around me settled into its familiar nighttime sounds, I understood something I hadn't before. He hadn't changed after the hospital. He had simply stopped pretending. That realization sat with me as the night stretched on, heavy and undeniable. Whatever came next wasn't going to be an argument or a misunderstanding. It was going to be the continuation of a pattern I'd ignored for far too long, and this time I knew better than to think it would resolve itself. By the time dawn broke and light crept across the walls of my room, I wasn't confused anymore. I was afraid, yes, but underneath the fear was something sharper. Clarity. I finally understood that the man who had walked into our lives offering help had been taking measurements from the very beginning. And now, after the hospital, he was done measuring. The ride home from the hospital should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like a quiet return to enemy territory. My mother drove with both hands tight on the steering wheel, eyes fixed straight ahead, talking about traffic and weather as if words could pave over what had happened. I watched familiar streets slide past the window and tried to steady my breathing. Every bump in the road sent a reminder through my abdomen that I wasn't healed no matter how badly he wanted me to be. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Same sagging porch step, same faded wreath still hanging on the door months past its season. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like a set piece carefully arranged to look harmless. He was already inside. I knew before I even saw him. The air felt different, heavier, like a room after an argument where no one bothered to raise their voice. My stepdad sat at the kitchen table, newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee mug. He looked up as we came in, his expression neutral, almost pleasant. "You're home," he said. "Good. No apology, no acknowledgement, not even the decency of pretending the hospital hadn't happened." He stood moved closer and stopped just short of invading my space. Up close, I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the way his gaze flicked briefly to my bandages and then away. "We'll talk later," he said calmly. "You need rest." It sounded reasonable. That's what made it unsettling. For the next 2 days, he was a different man. Or at least he played one convincingly. He spoke softly, asked if I needed anything, brought me food I hadn't requested, and set it down carefully like an offering. He didn't touch me, didn't raise his voice. If anyone had walked into the house during those hours, they would have seen a concerned stepfather tending to an unwell adult child. But the kindness felt rehearsed, timed. He was careful about when he spoke to me and who was around when he did. Never alone, never when my mother was out of earshot. It was as if the hospital incident had taught him something important about witnesses. That alone would have been enough to keep me on edge. What made it worse were the things he said when he thought he was being helpful. "Once you're back on your feet," he mentioned casually one afternoon leaning against the doorway, "we'll need to revisit how things work around here. When, not if." He talked about responsibility the way other people talked about weather, as if it were a force that moved independently of circumstance. He mentioned contributing, pulling weight, being realistic about limitations. All without ever looking directly at my stitches or acknowledging the pain that still knotted my body every time I shifted. My mother echoed him without realizing it. She repeated his phrases almost word for word, her voice softer, but the message unchanged. "He just wants what's best. We all have to do our part." She avoided my eyes when she said it, as if afraid I'd ask her to explain. The house itself began to change in small, almost invisible ways. He started asking where I was going when I stood up, how long I'd be, whether I really needed to do that right now. He framed it as concern as protection. Recovery, he said, was fragile. I shouldn't push myself. Then he suggested I limit visitors, just until I was stronger, just to avoid stress. When a friend called, he answered the phone and told her I was resting. When I questioned it later, he smiled and said he'd forgotten to pass along the message. I started to feel like a guest in my own life. On the 3rd day home, I noticed something small that didn't belong. A folder on the edge of the kitchen counter tucked beneath a stack of mail. It wasn't addressed to me, but my name was typed neatly on the tab. No handwriting, no explanation, just my name printed and precise. I didn't open it. I didn't touch it. I stood there longer than I should have, memorizing its position the way it leaned slightly to the left, the faint crease along its edge. Something about it made my stomach tighten. That evening, it was gone. The counter was clean, wiped down so thoroughly it almost gleamed. I asked my mother if she'd moved it. She frowned, said she hadn't seen any folder. When I mentioned it to him, he looked genuinely puzzled for a split second before shaking his head. "You must be mistaken," he said gently. "You've been on a lot of medication." The doubt crept in fast and unwelcome. I replayed the moment in my head, questioned my memory, wondered if pain and exhaustion had invented something that hadn't been there. That's when I realized how dangerous this was becoming, not because I was wrong, but because he wanted me to believe I was. That night I couldn't sleep. The house settled into its usual rhythms, but I stayed awake listening. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Low voices murmured. When I shifted in bed, the sound stopped abruptly. The next day I began testing the house. Nothing obvious, nothing reckless. I moved a book on the coffee table just a few inches, left a kitchen cabinet slightly ajar, placed my keys in a different spot than usual. Hours later, the book was back where it belonged. The cabinet closed. My keys returned to their original hook. No one mentioned it. No one needed to. The realization sent a cold wave through me. I wasn't just being watched. I was being managed. My mother drifted further away emotionally, if not physically. When I tried to talk to her alone, she grew nervous, glancing toward the hallway, as if expecting interruption. She dismissed my concerns, told me I needed to focus on healing, not stress myself with unnecessary thoughts. Her compliance hurt more than his control. It meant I was truly alone. One evening, as I passed the study, I noticed the door was locked. It hadn't been before. When I asked him about it, he didn't hesitate. "Important paperwork," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." His tone was light, but his eyes stayed on mine a beat too long, daring me to challenge him. I didn't. Later that night, I heard movement behind that door. Drawers opening, paper shifting, a low voice on the phone too quiet to catch words but firm enough to suggest certainty. When I stepped closer, the sound stopped. A moment later, he emerged, smiling, asking if I needed anything. I shook my head. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid he could hear it. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I stopped trying to understand him emotionally. I stopped asking why. I started paying attention to patterns instead, to timing, to language, to the spaces he guarded and the silences he cultivated. I made a rule for myself that night. Say less. Notice more. I moved carefully after that, blending into the background of my own life. I thanked him when he's brought me food, agreed when he suggested rest, let him believe his version of me was accurate, weak, grateful, dependent. It worked. He relaxed just slightly, enough to grow careless. A few nights later, as I lay awake, I heard him on the phone again. This time, a phrase slipped through the wall before he lowered his voice. A single sentence that made my chest tighten, because it aligned too perfectly with the folder I'd seen and the door he'd locked. I stared at the ceiling, my pulse steady, despite the fear threading through me. That was when I understood something crucial. I wasn't living in a house anymore. I was living inside someone else's plan. The morning after that phone call, I woke before the sun. The house was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if it were holding its breath. I lay still for a long time, listening, counting the seconds between distant sounds. A floorboard creaked somewhere down the hall. A door opened, then closed. Everything felt amplified, like my senses had been tuned too high. When I finally got up, the house looked unchanged. Same furniture, same pictures on the walls, same faint smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. But something was different. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It felt watchful. I moved slowly, partly because of my body, partly because instinct told me to. As I passed through the living room, I had the distinct sensation of being observed, even though no one was there. It was absurd, I told myself, and yet I checked behind me anyway. He knew where I was going before I told him. It happened casually. I mentioned I was stepping outside for a few minutes just to sit on the porch. He nodded, didn't look up from what he was doing, and said, "Don't stay out too long. It's cooler than it looks." I hadn't mentioned the weather. I hadn't mentioned how long I planned to be gone. Little moments like that started stacking up. He referenced conversations I'd had privately with my mother, commented on errands I'd only thought about running. Once he asked why I'd moved a chair in the dining room, his tone curious, almost amused. I stared at him, trying to remember if I'd even done it consciously. For the first time, I wondered if the house itself was helping him. That afternoon, I stepped outside and ran into Mrs. Alvarez from next door. She'd lived there longer than anyone knew the rhythms of the street, the comings and goings. She smiled at me, then hesitated, her eyes flicking briefly toward our front door. "You been home a lot lately," she said carefully. I told her I was recovering from surgery. She nodded sympathy, softening her face. Then she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Your stepdad's been around more too," she added. "Always home. Always watching." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. But it sent a jolt through me. If she'd noticed then, it wasn't just in my head. That evening, I tried to talk to my mother. I waited until he stepped out to take a call, the door closing behind him with a soft click. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where we used to talk late into the night before everything changed. "Mom," I said quietly. "Are you okay?" She stiffened immediately. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, then back to me. "Of course I am. I mean, really, okay," I pressed. "Things feel off." Her jaw tightened. "You're imagining things," she said too quickly. "You've been through a lot. You need to rest." The words weren't hers, not really. They were his, delivered through her mouth. I felt something break inside me, then not loudly but cleanly. A final crack. When he returned, the conversation ended without ever officially ending. My mother stood up, busied herself with the sink, her back to me. I understood then that she wasn't just silent, she was scared, and fear had taught her to survive by agreeing. The rules changed after that, though no one announced them. He started commenting on my schedule, framing it as concern, asked why I needed to leave the house at all, suggested it might be better if I stayed and conserved energy. He used "we" a lot. "We think it's best. We need to be careful," as if consensus already existed. One door in the house began to stay locked. It was the small study at the end of the hall, a room that used to be nothing more than storage. One afternoon I noticed the handle wouldn't turn. When I mentioned it casually, he didn't miss a beat. "Just organizing some things," he said. "Important paperwork." His explanation was too smooth, too rehearsed, and he stood in front of the door as he said it, his body angled protectively, blocking my view. That night, long after everyone should have been asleep, I heard activity coming from inside that room. The soft slide of drawers, paper being shifted, a light glow seeping out from under the door. I didn't approach. I didn't ask. I stayed in my room, heart pounding, listening to the sounds of a house rearranging itself around secrets. I began to understand the trap. It wasn't built all at once. It was assembled through comfort, through routine, through the gradual erosion of resistance. He didn't need chains or locks on every door. He needed predictability, compliance, silence. So I stopped asking questions. I smiled when appropriate, thanked him for meals, followed the new unspoken rules. I became agreeable, forgettable. I let him believe he'd won something. Inside, I was cataloging everything. The times he left the house, the way his tone changed on certain phone calls, the names he almost said out loud before catching himself, the room he guarded most fiercely, the way he watched my reactions, not for anger, but for awareness. Late one night, I woke to the sound of movement again. I sat up slowly, listening. The house was dark, but that familiar glow slipped out from under the study door. I crept closer this time, careful, every step deliberate. I didn't get close enough to hear words, but I didn't need to. The message was clear. Something was happening inside my own home, something I wasn't meant to see. I stood there for a long moment, then retreated quietly back to my room. My hands were shaking, but my mind was steady. That was the night I stopped thinking of the house as shelter. It wasn't just holding secrets anymore. It was helping him hide them. It started with something so small I almost dismissed it. The house was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that felt temporary, like it was waiting for someone to come home and give it purpose again. My stepdad had stepped out. My mother was in the backyard on the phone, and for once, I was alone without feeling watched. I moved slowly through the kitchen, sorting mail that had piled up on the counter. Bills, grocery ads, a catalog neither of us had ever ordered. Then I saw it. An envelope tucked beneath the stack, heavier than the rest, its edges crisp. No postage, no return address, just my name typed neatly on the front, not handwritten, typed, precise, as if it had been printed to look official even before it needed to be. My stomach tightened. I didn't open it. I didn't even touch it at first. I stood there staring, letting the moment settle. Everything in me wanted to know what was inside, but something stronger told me not to. Curiosity was a reflex. Survival was a decision. I memorized it instead. The way it was angled slightly to the right, the faint smudge near the corner, the fact that it was wedged under other mail, not placed on top, as if it wasn't meant to be noticed yet. When my mother came back inside, I stepped away from the counter. We talked about nothing. Weather, dinner. Her voice sounded tired, thinner than usual. I watched her hands as she moved around the kitchen, noticed how often she glanced toward the hallway, toward the locked study door. That evening after dinner, I returned to the counter. The envelope was gone. Not just moved, gone. The stack of mail had been straightened, squared off neatly, like someone had wiped the surface clean. My heart started racing fast and sharp. I asked my mother if she'd moved it. What envelope, she asked, frowning. When my stepdad came in, I mentioned it casually, careful to keep my tone light. There was an envelope here earlier with my name on it. Did you see it? He paused just long enough to register the question, then smiled. No, he said. You must be mistaken. His voice was calm, reassuring. He tilted his head slightly the way people do when they're trying to be understanding. You've been on strong medication. Memory can get fuzzy. The words hit harder than I expected. For a split second, doubt crept in slick and insidious. Had I imagined it? Had pain and exhaustion filled in details that weren't real? Then I remembered the smudge, the angle, the weight of the paper beneath my eyes. I knew what I'd seen. That was the moment it shifted from unsettling to dangerous. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask again. Instead, I started testing the house more deliberately. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would draw attention. I moved a picture frame on the mantel just an inch to the left a notebook on the coffee table instead of my nightstand, set my shoes by the back door instead of the front. Each time within hours, things returned to their original places. Sometimes subtly, sometimes perfectly. No comments, no acknowledgement. Just quiet correction. I realized then that the house wasn't just being monitored, it was being managed. And the envelope hadn't disappeared by accident. It had been retrieved. Once I saw it that way, everything else clicked into place. The locked study door, the late-night phone calls, the way he spoke about the future as if it were already settled, the way my mother repeated his phrases like lines she'd practiced. He wasn't reacting to me. He was preparing for something. A few days later, he sat across from me at the table, coffee steaming between us, his tone almost warm. "I've been thinking about how to make things easier for you," he said. "You've had a rough time. We don't want you worrying about things you can't handle." The words sounded kind. The message underneath was not. I appreciate that I said, keeping my voice steady, my eyes down. I let my shoulders slump slightly, just enough to reinforce the picture he already had of me. He smiled. Not wide. Satisfied. That night I lay awake, listening to the house settle. Around midnight, I heard his voice again, low and controlled, coming from the study. I couldn't make out full sentences, but certain words floated through the door like smoke. Timing. Coverage. Responsibility. My name was never said. That felt intentional. I started keeping track of time, of routines, of patterns. He left the house at the same times on the same days. He made his calls in the same rooms with the same posture, his back always turned. He grew irritated when routines were disrupted even slightly. Once I lingered too long in the hallway outside the study. The door opened abruptly, and he looked at me, eyes sharp. "Did you need something?" he asked. I shook my head, feigning confusion, just getting water. He watched me for a moment longer than necessary, then stepped aside, letting me pass. When I returned to my room, my hands were trembling, but my face remained calm. That mattered. The next day, he approached me with another offer disguised as help. "I've been handling a lot of the paperwork around here," he said. "It might be best if I continue doing that. Less stress for everyone." I nodded. "If you think that's best." The relief on his face was almost imperceptible. Almost. Inside, something hardened. This wasn't about care. It wasn't about family. It was about control, and he was tightening it slowly, methodically, counting on my silence to make it easier. I thought about the envelope again, about what kind of document would have my name printed on it but not delivered, about why it would appear and disappear without explanation, about why it would be hidden until the timing was right. That's when I understood something crucial. Whatever he was planning didn't require my consent. It required my absence, my compliance, my inability to object, and that terrified me more than the slap ever had. That night I made a decision. I would stop trying to understand this emotionally. I would stop hoping my mother would suddenly see what I saw, Hope was a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, I would gather information, quietly, patiently, without leaving a trail. I stopped reacting entirely. I became agreeable to the point of invisibility. I let him believe his version of reality had taken hold. I thanked him. I deferred. I appeared grateful. It worked. He began speaking more freely, not realizing how much I was listening. He corrected himself less, let small details slip, treated outcomes as foregone conclusions. One evening, as he stood by the sink, he said something that confirmed everything. Soon he remarked casually, "This will all be settled." Soon. He didn't say what. He didn't have to. The certainty in his voice told me enough. I went to my room afterward and sat on the bed, staring at my hands until they stopped shaking. I felt small, yes, but I also felt awake in a way I hadn't been in years. The envelope wasn't a mistake. It wasn't premature. It was a rehearsal. And whatever role he'd written for me in that script, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to follow it quietly. I stopped confronting him the day I realized confrontation was exactly what he wanted. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no moment of bravery or speech in the mirror. It came quietly in the space between one shallow breath and the next, when I understood that every question I asked only sharpened his control. Every objection gave him something to push against. Silence, on the other hand, made him careless. My recovery gave me the perfect disguise. I moved slowly, carefully, leaning into the image he already had of me. Weak, dependent, temporarily inconvenient. He underestimated me because he needed to. A man like him couldn't function if he believed the people around him were watching closely. So I let him believe I wasn't. I followed the new routines without complaint. Ate when he suggested, rested when he told me to. I stopped asking about paperwork, finances, decisions. I thanked him for things I didn't want and accepted help I didn't need. Each time I did, I felt something in him loosen just a fraction. He began to relax. It showed in small ways at first. He corrected me less often. His tone softened, almost indulgent, like a teacher satisfied with a slow student finally learning her place. He spoke more freely around me, assuming I wasn't really listening. That's when I started watching him properly. I learned his patterns, the way he always checked his phone before making certain calls. The times of day he was most distracted, most confident. He paced when he was irritated, stood still when he was calculating. His voice dropped when he felt powerful, rose only when he felt challenged. I kept everything in my head. No notes, no lists, no evidence he could find. Memory became my safest storage. There were windows of opportunity too, predictable ones. He left the house on the same days at nearly the same times, believing my recovery limited my movement. When he was gone, the house exhaled. My mother retreated into herself, spending hours in the bedroom or the yard, avoiding the spaces he controlled most. I used those windows carefully. I didn't rush. I didn't pry. I opened drawers only long enough to register what was inside. I checked shelves without moving anything. I learned which rooms he touched daily and which he ignored completely. The locked study remained off-limits. I didn't test it, not yet. Pushing too hard too soon would raise questions I wasn't ready to answer. One afternoon, while pretending to nap on the couch, I overheard him on the phone in the next room. His voice was low, measured, confident. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough to make my pulse quicken. He spoke about timelines the way someone talks about appointments already scheduled. He referenced authority as if it were a given, not something that needed permission. When the call ended, he walked past me without realizing my eyes were open. That was my first real confirmation. Not suspicion, not instinct, certainty. Later that evening, I almost made a mistake. I was standing near the hallway listening as he moved around the study when the floorboard creaked beneath my foot. The sound was small, but it might as well have been a shout. The door opened suddenly and he stepped out, his expression sharp. "Can I help you?" he asked. For a split second, panic flared. Then I let my shoulders slump and my face soften. I blinked at him slowly, like someone just waking from a dream. "I thought you called me," I said, my voice thin, uncertain. He studied me, eyes searching for something I refused to give him. After a moment, his posture relaxed. "No," he said. "You should be resting." I nodded, apologized, and shuffled back to my room, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When the door closed behind me, I sank onto the bed and waited for the shaking to stop. That close call taught me something important. He wasn't paranoid yet. He didn't suspect me, but he was alert enough to test. From then on, I was more careful. I started measuring time instead of emotion. How long he stayed in certain rooms, how often he checked locks, which days he seemed most preoccupied with calls, and which days he avoided the phone altogether. I also began to notice something else. Names. Not spoken directly, but implied. References to people outside the house, to conversations I wasn't part of, to obligations that existed somewhere beyond my line of sight. One name stuck with me. He mentioned it once, almost offhand during a call, then never again. But it lingered in my mind, tethered to the sense that his world extended far beyond our walls. Power, I realized, wasn't volume. It wasn't aggression or authority. It was information. And for the first time since he'd entered our lives, I was beginning to gather some of my own. I stopped hoping my mother would intervene. I stopped expecting her to notice the same things I did. Her survival strategy was different from mine. She coped by agreeing. I coped by observing. Neither of us was wrong, but only one of us could stop what was coming. Some nights, the weight of it pressed down on me so hard I could barely breathe. The loneliness, the fear of miscalculating, the knowledge that one wrong move could accelerate everything before I was ready. But even then, I didn't doubt the path I'd chosen. Waiting wasn't passive anymore. It was preparation. One evening, as I passed through the living room, he looked up from his chair and smiled at me. "You're doing better," he said. "I can tell." I smiled back just enough. "I'm trying." He nodded, satisfied, already turning his attention elsewhere. He had no idea how true my words were. That night I lay in bed replaying everything I'd learned so far. The envelope, the locked room, the phone calls, the timelines spoken with such confidence. A pattern was emerging, and it pointed outward, not inward. Whatever he was planning didn't end in this house. As I stared at the ceiling, that lingering name surfaced again in my thoughts. The one from the phone call, the one I hadn't heard before. It felt like a thread dangling just out of reach, connected to something larger, older, and far more dangerous than I'd imagined. I understood then that watching him wasn't enough. I needed to know who he'd been before he found us, and whether someone else had already learned the hard way what he was capable of doing. I wasn't looking for anyone from his past when they found me. That's what still unsettles me the most. I wasn't searching, reaching out, or leaving breadcrumbs. I was surviving quietly. And yet somehow the past slipped through the cracks of my careful silence and landed right in front of me. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that feels forgettable until it isn't. My mother had gone out to run errands with him, and I was alone in the house, resting on the couch with a blanket pulled up to my waist. My phone buzzed beside me, the screen lighting up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Unknown numbers had started to feel dangerous. But something made me pick it up anyway, my thumb hovering for a second before I answered. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end. Not the awkward pause of a wrong number, but a measured one, like someone deciding how much truth to give. "I hope I have the right person," a woman said finally. Her voice was calm, low, and tired in a way that immediately caught my attention. "I'm calling about your stepfather." My chest tightened. "I think you might have the wrong number," I said, already preparing to hang up. She didn't rush me. "He goes by a different last name now," she said. "But he used to live in Cedar Ridge, about 12 years ago." I froze. That was a detail I hadn't shared with anyone. Not even my mother talked about his life before her. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said carefully. "I understand," she replied. "You don't know me, and you shouldn't trust me." I wouldn't. That alone made me pause. She didn't ask me questions. She didn't push. Instead, she said, "I just wanted to tell you that if he's starting to talk about responsibility and timelines, you're already further along than you think." The words sent a chill straight through me. I stood up slowly, moving toward the window, my heart pounding hard enough that I was sure she could hear it through the phone. "Who are you?" I asked. There was another pause. Then she said, "Someone who didn't see it in time." I didn't tell her anything after that. Not my name, not where I lived, not what was happening in the house. I listened instead. Listened as she spoke in careful fragments, never offering more than she had to. She told me about charm that arrived disguised as help, about control that started with finances and ended with silence, about being told she was fragile, unreliable, too emotional to make decisions for herself. She didn't need to describe the details. I recognized the shape of the story instantly. "This isn't the first time," she said quietly, "and it won't be the last if no one interrupts it." I wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't know him like I did, that she didn't understand the context, but the words wouldn't come. Because she did know him, not as my stepfather, as a pattern. "Why are you calling me?" I asked finally. "Because I heard he'd moved again," she said. "And because every time he does, someone new ends up asking themselves the same questions I ignored." I thought about the envelope, the locked study, the phone calls. The way he spoke about the future, as if it were already decided. "What happens when someone becomes inconvenient?" I asked before I could stop myself. She didn't answer right away. "When someone starts asking the wrong questions," she said slowly, "the timeline changes." That was when fear sharpened into something else. Focus. I asked her to tell me one thing only, not everything. Just one thing that would help me understand what I was dealing with. "He never acts alone," she said. "And he never improvises. Everything he does looks reasonable on the surface. That's how he survives." Before I could ask more, she told me she wouldn't call again unless I asked her to. She gave me a first name, no last name, and said, "If you ever hear him mention a document before it exists, you're already in danger." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time after phone pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. When my mother and stepdad returned home later that evening, I watched him differently. Every word he said landed with new weight. Every glance carried intention I hadn't seen before. I noticed how he never asked my mother's opinion without reframing it as agreement. How he spoke about me when I wasn't in the room, but never directly to me about the same things. That night I couldn't sleep. I replayed the call over and over, testing it for holes, for exaggeration, for manipulation. But the details lined up too perfectly, not the facts, the behaviors, the language, the rhythm of control. The next day I called the number back. It went to voicemail, no name, no message, just silence. I left nothing. 2 days later, my stepdad mentioned something at dinner that made my stomach drop. "Some paperwork should be finalized soon," he said, casually passing the salt. "Once that's done, things will be much simpler for him." My mother nodded. "That's good," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. I pushed my food around my plate and said nothing. That night, I heard him on the phone again. This time I caught more, enough to confirm what the woman had warned me about. He spoke with certainty, not hope. He referenced outcomes as settled, not pending. He talked about authority, like it was already his. When the call ended, I sat in the dark, my hands clenched in my lap, and understood something that changed everything. This wasn't just about control inside our family. It was about leverage outside of it. About systems and procedures designed to look neutral while quietly erasing people. I reached out again the next morning. This time the call went through. "I was hoping you'd call," she said. We spoke carefully, in fragments. I shared only what was necessary. The locked room, the missing envelope, the way he'd started framing the future without me in it. She listened without interrupting. "You're closer to the edge than I was when I realized," she said. "That gives you an advantage. What do I do?" I asked. "You don't confront him," she said immediately. "Not yet. You don't warn him. You don't let him know you see the pattern. You let him think he's ahead." The advice matched everything I'd already learned the hard way. She told me about a specific habit of his. Something small, something he thought was harmless, a detail so ordinary I'd overlooked it completely. When she mentioned it, my breath caught. I'd seen it, more than once. The locked study, the envelope, the calls. Suddenly they weren't isolated pieces anymore. They were part of the same structure. Before we hung up, she said one last thing. "He counts on people doubting themselves. That's where he gets his power." After the call ended, I sat very still and let the truth settle. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't alone. But that didn't mean I was safe. If anything, it meant the opposite, because now I knew there was a map beneath the chaos, a design behind the fear, and if I wanted to survive what was coming, I couldn't just watch anymore. I would have to choose my moment. Carefully. Quietly. Before his timeline reached the point of no return. Knowing where to look changes everything. After that call, I stopped guessing. I stopped wondering if I was imagining connections that weren't there. The fear didn't disappear, but it sharpened, focused itself into something usable. I understood now that this wasn't about stumbling onto evidence by accident. It was about timing, about patience, about choosing the right moment and not wasting it. I watched him more closely than ever, not openly, not obviously. I watched the way a person watches traffic before crossing a busy street, measuring speed and distance, waiting for the brief window when it's safe to move. His routines became predictable once I stopped reacting emotionally. He left the house on the same mornings, took the same calls in the same rooms, locked the same doors even when no one else was home. He believed he had already won. That belief was his weakness. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One morning he announced he had an appointment and would be gone for several hours. He said it casually like it was nothing worth remembering. My mother was distracted, preoccupied with something he'd asked her to handle. She barely noticed when I stood up from the table and moved toward the hallway. I felt my pulse in my throat as the front door closed behind him. I didn't rush. That was the most important thing. Panic leaves fingerprints. I waited, counted my breaths, listened to the house settle into silence. Only when I was sure he wasn't coming back did I move toward the locked study. The door was heavier than it looked, solid, intentional. My hands trembled as I turned the key I'd quietly copied days earlier, my body protesting every movement. Pain flared along my incision, sharp and insistent, but I ignored it. There wouldn't be another chance like this. The room inside wasn't personal. That struck me immediately. No photos, no sentimental clutter, just shelves, drawers, files arranged with precise efficiency. It felt less like a home office and more like a workspace, a place where decisions were made without emotion. I closed the door softly behind me and stood there for a moment, grounding myself. I didn't have time to search everything. I knew that. I went straight to the drawer I'd seen him open more than once. The document was exactly where it shouldn't have been. It was neatly organized, clipped together, labeled with dates and names that made my stomach drop. My name appeared more than once, typed cleanly, without hesitation. There was no question mark anywhere. No space left for uncertainty. This wasn't a draft. This was a plan waiting for activation. As I scanned the pages, everything I'd noticed over the past week snapped into place. The hospital slap, the sudden kindness afterward, the envelope that appeared and disappeared, the locked door, the phone calls spoken with such confidence. None of it had been improvised. Every step had been calculated, layered carefully on top of the last. My hands started shaking, not from shock, but from the weight of what I was reading. The document assumed outcomes that hadn't happened yet. It treated future decisions as already settled. It positioned me not as a participant, but as an obstacle to be managed. I felt cold all over. This wasn't about helping me recover. It wasn't about family or responsibility. It was about removing me from the equation entirely, quietly, legally, permanently. I forced myself to stop reading before panic took over. I didn't take the document. That choice nearly broke me. Every instinct screamed to grab it, to run, to put it somewhere safe. But I knew better. Removing it would alert him immediately. He would know I'd seen it, and then everything would accelerate beyond my control. So I memorized it instead. The wording, the structure, the assumptions baked into every paragraph. I fixed details in my mind the way someone memorizes an escape route in a burning building. I took note of dates, references, language that revealed exactly how confident he was that this would work. That confidence terrified me more than the document itself. A sudden sound outside the room made my heart leap into my throat. A car door. A voice. I froze, listening, every muscle locked in place. Seconds stretched unbearably long. Then I realized it was a neighbor passing by, her laughter drifting through an open window. Still, I didn't linger. I returned everything exactly as I'd found it, closed the drawer, straightened the files, locked the door. When I stepped back into the hallway, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I made it to my room and sat down hard on the bed, pressing my hands against my stomach as waves of pain and adrenaline crashed through me. I stayed there until my breathing slowed. When he came home later that afternoon, I was back on the couch, blanket pulled up, book open in my lap. He glanced at me, nodded once, and went about his business. He had no idea how close he'd come to being exposed, or how much that ignorance was about to cost him. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I replayed the document in my mind piece by piece, testing it against everything I'd learned so far. The woman's warning, the habits she'd mentioned, the structure beneath his behavior. It all aligned, too perfectly to ignore. I understood then that proof alone wasn't enough. Exposing him would require timing witnesses and systems that could not be intimidated or manipulated. I couldn't confront him privately. I couldn't accuse him emotionally. I had to let him walk straight into a situation where the truth would reveal itself without me saying a word. That realization changed the fear into something steadier. Resolve. The next morning, he spoke openly about upcoming plans, about things being finalized soon. His voice carried satisfaction, the sound of a man who believed the hardest part was already behind him. I nodded along, asked no questions, played my role perfectly. Inside, I was counting days. The document wasn't hidden because it was dangerous. It was hidden because it wasn't finished doing its job yet. And now that I'd seen it, I knew exactly when and where the trap needed to be set. All I had to do was wait for him to spring it himself. Knowing wasn't enough anymore. That became clear the night after I read the document. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every line, every assumption baked into those pages. He wasn't waiting to see how things unfolded. He was waiting for the right moment to press a button. And once he did, there would be no undoing it. I understood then that silence alone wouldn't save me. Watching wouldn't either. I had reached the edge of observation. If I stayed there too long, I would fall. So I started thinking in terms of outcomes instead of emotions. What did I need to stop? What did I need to expose? And most importantly, how could I do it without alerting him even a second too early? The answer came slowly in pieces. He relied on systems, on procedures that looked neutral and professional from the outside. He trusted those systems because they had worked for him before. That was where his confidence came from, and that was exactly where it could be used against him. The first step was defining my objective. I wasn't trying to punish him. I wasn't trying to humiliate him. I needed to prevent the document from being activated, and to make sure that when it surfaced, it did so in a way he couldn't control or explain away. If I failed at that, everything else was irrelevant. The second step was deciding what I could not do. I could not confront him privately. He would deny, deflect, and accelerate. I could not warn my mother directly, not yet. She was too deep inside his version of reality, and fear would drive her straight back to him. I could not act emotionally no matter how badly I wanted to. Every move had to look like compliance. That part came easily, disturbingly so. I had years of practice. I became even quieter, more agreeable. I thanked him for managing things. I accepted his framing of my recovery without question. I let him explain plans as if they were benevolent favors instead of strategic maneuvers. Each time I did, I watched him grow more relaxed. He started talking more, not to me directly, but around me. He mentioned appointments, deadlines, paperwork being finalized. He spoke about the future with a casual certainty that made my stomach twist. He assumed I wasn't tracking details. That assumption was my leverage. I reached out carefully to the woman who had called me, not for reassurance, for alignment. We spoke briefly, cautiously, never staying on the line long enough to feel safe. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't need to. She recognized the shape of the situation as soon as I described the document in general terms. He'll move faster if he senses hesitation, she warned, but he'll rush if he thinks he's already won. That stuck with me. Rushing was a mistake he could make, and mistakes were openings. Together we mapped the outline of a trap without ever calling it that. No dramatic plans, no heroics, just positioning, timing, making sure the right people were present when the document emerged from hiding. I didn't recruit allies the way you see in movies. There were no whispered meetings or late-night plotting sessions. There was one additional contact, someone who understood procedures and process, someone who wouldn't be swayed by charm or intimidation, someone boring, methodical, and immune to theatrics. That was exactly the kind of person he underestimated. Back in the house, I performed weakness with even greater precision. I moved slowly, asked fewer questions, deferred constantly. When he explained things, I nodded as if they were already beyond my understanding. He loved that. It fed something in him I'd never fully named before. Control wasn't enough. He needed to be believed. My mother hovered at the edges of all this, confused and increasingly anxious. I could see the strain on her face, the way she flinched when he raised his voice even slightly. She sensed something was wrong, but not what it was. And she didn't ask me. That hurt, but I understood it now. Fear teaches people to look away. The trigger point revealed itself sooner than I expected. One evening over dinner, he mentioned an upcoming meeting as if it were a formality. His tone was light, almost celebratory. He said it would wrap things up and that afterward we could all finally move forward. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. I asked casually, "When is that?" He smiled. Soon. Soon wasn't a date. Soon was a threat. That night, I barely slept. I replayed everything I'd prepared, testing it for weaknesses. There were so many ways it could go wrong, so many variables I couldn't control. The biggest risk wasn't him, it was time. If he moved the meeting forward, if he changed the order of steps, if he decided to act without warning, the entire plan would collapse. And then, just when I thought I had one more day to prepare, he changed the timeline himself. He told us at breakfast. Plans shifted, he said, buttering his toast with infuriating calm. The meeting's been moved up. My mother looked startled. I felt my pulse spike, then steady. This was the moment the woman had warned me about. Acceleration meant confidence. Confidence meant carelessness. I kept my face neutral. "That's good, right?" He nodded. "Very good." Inside, everything tightened into focus. There was no more room for adjustment, no more waiting. The trap was either going to work exactly as planned or not at all. I spent the rest of the day in a strange, suspended state. Every sound felt too loud. Every minute stretched thin. I double-checked what I could without making calls or sending messages. Everything was in place, or as close to it as it would ever be. That evening, he poured himself a drink and talked about the future like it was already settled, about how things would be simpler, about how everyone would be better off once the hard decisions were made. He didn't look at me when he said it. I realized then that he truly believed I was already gone. Not physically, but functionally, reduced to a formality, a box to be checked. That belief was the final piece I needed. Later that night, alone in my room, doubt crept in for the first time since I'd read the document. What if I was wrong? What if I'd misunderstood something crucial? What if pushing this forward made everything worse? I pictured the hospital floor, the cold tiles, the taste of blood in my mouth, the way he'd looked at me afterward, measuring, already moving on. The doubt evaporated. I wasn't doing this to win. I was doing it to survive. When I lay down to sleep, I knew it would be the last night things existed in this fragile balance. By the next day, everything would be exposed one way or another. As I closed my eyes, one thought anchored me steady and unshakable. He believed he was in control, and that belief was about to become his undoing. The morning he believed he'd won was strangely peaceful. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, soft and forgiving, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. He stood at the counter, sipping his coffee, shoulders relaxed, humming under his breath. It was the first time in weeks I'd seen him that comfortable. That alone told me everything I needed to know. He was already living in the future he'd planned. "Big day," he said, casually glancing at his watch. "Lots to take care of." I nodded from my seat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't touched. My body felt heavy, not with fear, but with restraint. Every instinct wanted to react, to prepare to move. Instead, I stayed still, obedient, invisible. "That's good," I said softly. "I'm glad things are getting settled." He smiled at that. Not warmly, satisfied, the kind of smile a man gives when the last obstacle finally steps aside. My mother hovered near the sink, her movements small and nervous. She watched him more than she watched me, her eyes flicking to his face whenever he spoke, searching for cues. She had no idea how close we were to the edge, or maybe she did and couldn't bear to look straight at it. I played my part perfectly that morning. I moved slowly, leaned into my physical limitations, asked questions that sounded naive instead of suspicious. When he explained things, I listened with what he mistook for gratitude. I let him talk. Let him frame the day as inevitable. He thrived on that. Throughout the morning, he made small comments that revealed just how confident he felt. He spoke openly about timelines, about responsibilities being transferred, about how complicated things would finally become simpler. Each word confirmed what I already knew. He thought the hardest part was behind him. That was when the real danger began. As the hours passed, I kept my focus narrow. No big thoughts, no emotional spirals, just awareness, the sound of his footsteps, the way he straightened his jacket before leaving, the briefcase he carried heavier than usual. He checked the locks twice before stepping outside, habit born of control, not fear. "Don't worry," he said to my mother as he headed for the door. "Everything's handled." Then he glanced at me. "Try to rest." I smiled faintly. "I will." The door closed behind him with a final, decisive click. For a moment, the house seemed to exhale. My mother slumped slightly, as if a string holding her upright had been cut. She didn't speak. Neither did I. We moved around each other in careful silence, each lost in our own version of dread. I retreated to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in my lap. This was the most dangerous part, not the confrontation, not the exposure, the waiting. Every minute stretched thin, taut with anticipation. I checked the time only once, then forced myself to stop. Watching the clock would only feed panic. Everything that could be done had already been done. Everything that would happen next was out of my hands. That was oddly comforting. When he returned later, the shift in the house was immediate. He moved with purpose, energy humming just beneath the surface. He didn't sit down, didn't linger. He spoke in short, efficient sentences, already reorganizing the world in his head. "It's done," he announced at dinner. "Or close enough." My mother looked up sharply. "Done?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Details, formalities, nothing to worry about." I kept my eyes on my plate. "That's a relief," I said quietly. He glanced at me, studying my face, searching for something. Doubt, resistance, awareness. I gave him none of it. After a moment, he nodded, reassured. That evening, I noticed a subtle change in him, a loosening. He corrected himself less, spoke more freely, mentioned names he hadn't before, details that would have mattered a great deal if he'd realized I was listening. At one point, he said something that made my pulse quicken. "They won't question it," he said confidently. "It's all perfectly reasonable on paper." Reasonable. That word had done more damage in our house than any raised voice ever could. Later, as I passed through the hallway, he stopped me with an unexpected question. "You understand why this is necessary, right?" he asked. The timing was wrong. The tone too careful. It was a test. I paused just long enough to appear confused, then nodded. "I trust you," I said. "You always know what's best." The words tasted bitter, but they landed exactly where I needed them to. His shoulders relaxed. The moment passed. That night I lay in bed, fully dressed, shoes by the door, heart steady despite the storm I knew was coming. I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. I listened instead, attuned to every sound, every shift in the house. At some point my phone buzzed quietly beside me. A message, brief and nondescript. Nothing incriminating. Nothing that could be traced. Just a signal. It was happening. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Silence was part of the plan. The next morning arrived too quickly. The air felt heavier, charged. My stepdad moved through the house with practiced ease, humming again, already celebrating in his own way. He dressed carefully, choosing his clothes with more attention than usual, straightening his tie in the mirror with a satisfied nod. He looked like a man about to close a deal. Before he left, he stopped in the doorway of my room. "We'll talk later," he said. "After everything's finalized." I met his gaze and smiled faintly. "Okay." He left with a spring in his step. As soon as the door closed, the house fell silent again. My mother stood in the hallway wringing her hands. She looked at me, eyes searching, uncertain. "Is everything all right?" she asked. I hesitated, then said gently, "It will be." I didn't explain. There wasn't time. And part of me knew that understanding would come better after the truth revealed itself, not before. The rest of the day passed in a blur of waiting and restraint. Every sound outside made my heart jump. Every passing car felt like a signal. I paced my room carefully, measured my breathing, reminded myself that fear didn't mean failure. Then finally my phone buzzed again. A second message. A confirmation. The trap was live. I sat down on the bed and let the weight of it settle over me. There was no turning back now, no adjustments, no last-minute changes. Everything I had feared and prepared for was about to converge in a single moment. I thought of the hospital floor, the slap, the way he'd looked at me as if I were already erased. I thought of the document, the assumptions, the quiet certainty that I would never object. He had underestimated one thing: patience. As evening approached, I knew this was the last stretch of calm before the collapse. The last hours where he believed the story he'd written would play out exactly as planned. He thought he was in control, and that was the most dangerous belief of all. The room was too quiet for what was about to happen. It wasn't a dramatic place. No raised platform, no grand courtroom theatrics, just a clean, neutral space where important decisions were made every day under the illusion of order. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A long table sat at the center, already arranged chairs pushed in neatly, as if nothing unexpected could possibly occur here. My stepdad walked in like he owned the outcome. His posture was relaxed, confident, his movements efficient. He shook hands, exchanged polite greetings, smiled the way men do when they believe the system is about to reward them. He didn't look at me right away. He didn't need to. In his mind, I was already a formality. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, my breathing steady. Every nerve in my body was awake, but I didn't let it show. I had learned by now that the most dangerous thing I could do was reveal awareness too soon. The meeting began the way he expected it to. Procedural, calm, predictable. Papers were referenced, names were confirmed, authority was assumed rather than questioned. He spoke smoothly, answering before questions were fully formed, guiding the conversation where he wanted it to go. I watched the way people nodded along, trusting the confidence in his voice. Then came the pause. It was small, almost imperceptible. A question asked slightly out of sequence, a request for clarification that shouldn't have mattered but did. The kind of interruption that makes someone who believes they're in control feel mildly irritated rather than alarmed. My stepdad leaned back in his chair, lips tightening just a fraction. "There shouldn't be any confusion," he said. "Everything is in order." The woman across the table glanced down at the paperwork again. "That's what we're confirming," she replied evenly. I felt my pulse quicken, but my face remained still. The next question landed harder. A date didn't align. A signature referenced something that hadn't officially occurred yet. Not an accusation, just an observation. Neutral, professional. Impossible to argue emotionally. My stepdad smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. "That's standard," he said quickly. "It's been explained already." Except it hadn't. The tone in the room shifted subtly. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward. Pens paused. Someone cleared their throat. I could almost hear the invisible gears grinding as the process slowed, resisting his attempts to push it forward. For the first time, he looked at me. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was calculation. A silent question flickering behind his eyes, as if he were trying to assess whether I'd done something he hadn't anticipated. I met his gaze briefly, then looked away. The request for additional documentation followed. That was when the first crack appeared. He straightened in his chair, irritation leaking into his voice. "That won't be necessary." The response came calmly. "It is. What happened next unfolded exactly the way he'd never planned for. The document emerged not from my hands but from the process itself, introduced without drama, presented as part of due diligence, not accusation. The wording on the page mirrored the structure I'd memorized in the study, the assumptions laid bare under professional scrutiny. I watched his face as recognition set in. Not panic. Not yet. First came disbelief, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the subtle shake of his head as if the room had betrayed him personally. "That's being taken out of context," he said sharply. "You're misunderstanding the intent." No one argued. They didn't need to. Because the next step wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Another document. Another inconsistency. A pattern emerging not because I pointed it out, but because it existed. The room grew very still. My stepdad's voice rose just slightly, the practiced calm beginning to crack. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I've handled situations like this before." That was his mistake. Handled situations like this before. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A few heads turned. Notes were made. The tone shifted from cooperative to cautious. I felt something inside me settle. He tried to regain control by force of personality. He leaned forward, spoke faster, louder, attempted to dominate the space the way he always had at home. But here authority didn't respond to volume. It responded to consistency. And consistency was not on his side. The final misstep came when he overreached. Pressed frustrated, he explained too much, filled in gaps no one had asked about, offered justification where silence would have served him better. Each word dug him deeper, tying his explanations to assumptions that no longer held. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The decision unfolded without drama. Authority was paused. Control was revoked. Processes were halted pending review. The outcome he'd counted on evaporated in front of him, replaced by something he couldn't intimidate or charm away. For the first time since I'd known him, my stepdad looked small. Not physically, emotionally, reduced to someone waiting for instructions instead of giving them. His mouth opened as if to speak again, then closed. There was nothing left he could say that wouldn't make it worse. Someone stood and gestured politely toward the door. That was it. No shouting, no revenge speech, no victory declaration. Just the quiet, irreversible shift of power away from him. As he was escorted out, he didn't look at me. Not once. He didn't have to. The room already knew who he was. I sat there for a moment after he was gone, my body suddenly aware of how exhausted it was. My hands trembled slightly now that I no longer needed to control them. I pressed them together, grounding myself. It was over. Not everything. But the worst of it. When I finally stood, the room felt different. Lighter. Not because justice was perfect, but because truth had been allowed to exist without being shouted down. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. My mother stood a few steps away, her face pale, eyes wide. She looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. I didn't rush toward her. I didn't need to. The hardest part was behind me now. The man who had built his power on silence and assumption no longer controlled the story. And for the first time since the hospital floor, since the taste of blood and the cold tiles against my skin, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel before. Safe. The silence afterward felt unfamiliar. Not empty. Not peaceful exactly. Just quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. When the door closed behind him and the sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway, I remained where I was for a moment longer than necessary, letting my body catch up to what had just happened. My hands were still trembling, not from fear this time, but from release. No one rushed me. No one spoke. The room slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Papers gathered, chairs pushed back into place. Life moved on with an ease that felt almost surreal. For so long, everything had revolved around his presence, his moods, his plans, and now suddenly it didn't. I stepped outside into the late afternoon air. It was cooler than I expected, crisp against my skin. I took a deep breath and felt it reach places in my chest that had been tight for years. For the first time since the hospital, my body didn't brace for impact. I saw him once more before I left. He stood a short distance away, shoulders slumped, staring at the ground as if it might offer him an explanation. Without the certainty he'd wrapped himself in, he looked smaller, older. Not defeated in a dramatic sense, just exposed. A man without the system he'd relied on to silence others. I felt no urge to say anything to him. No final words waited on my tongue. The need to confront, to accuse, to unload years of suppressed anger had evaporated somewhere along the way. Power didn't belong to whoever spoke last. It belonged to whoever no longer needed to speak at all. My mother was waiting by the car. She looked lost, not broken, but untethered, as if something she'd leaned on for balance had suddenly disappeared. When she saw me, her eyes filled and she reached out hesitantly, unsure whether she had the right. I didn't pull away. We sat together in silence on the drive home. No accusations, no explanations. Just the hum of the engine and the knowledge that something irreversible had shifted between us. She kept glancing at me like she was seeing me through a new lens, one she wasn't sure how to adjust yet. At home, the house felt different. The same walls, the same furniture, but the air moved freely again. I noticed it immediately. No weight pressing down, no sense of being watched. The rooms no longer felt like extensions of someone else's will. That night, my mother finally spoke. "I didn't see it," she said quietly, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. Or maybe I did, and I was too afraid to name it. Her voice trembled, but there was honesty in it I hadn't heard in a long time. "I know," I said, and I meant it. We didn't solve everything in that conversation. There were no promises of sudden change or perfect understanding. Healing doesn't work that way. What we did establish were boundaries, clear ones. I told her what I could offer and what I couldn't. Compassion, yes. Control, no. Support, yes. Silence at my own expense, never again. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, and for the first time, she didn't argue. In the days that followed, I took inventory of what I'd gotten back. My name, my voice, my right to make decisions about my own life without someone reframing them as weaknesses. I regained autonomy that I hadn't realized had been slipping away piece by piece. I also took inventory of what I hadn't. Time for one. Years spent doubting my instincts, relationships strained by my constant state of vigilance, the illusion that family always protects its own. That illusion didn't survive, and I didn't try to rebuild it. Closure, I learned, isn't about erasing what happened. It's about no longer living inside it. One evening as I stood in my room folding clothes, my eyes drifted to the floor near the bed. For a split second, memory pulled me back to the hospital. The cold tiles, the way the world tilted, the metallic taste in my mouth, the humiliation of being reduced to something inconvenient and disposable. For a long time I'd thought that moment defined me. Now I understood it differently. That was the moment something in me woke up. Not courage, not anger, awareness. The understanding that silence doesn't keep the peace. It only protects whoever benefits from it most. I didn't rebuild my life overnight. I didn't need to. What I rebuilt first was trust in myself, in the quiet voice that had been warning me all along, in the instinct that told me something was wrong, even when everyone around me insisted it wasn't. Life became quieter after that, simpler in ways that mattered. I stopped measuring my worth by someone else's standards. I stopped explaining my boundaries as if they were apologies. I chose dignity over comfort, even when comfort tempted me to stay quiet again. Sometimes people ask if I regret not speaking up sooner. The answer is no. I spoke when I was ready, when I could do it without destroying myself in the process. Survival looks different for everyone, and mine required patience, observation, and timing. If you're listening to this and something about it feels familiar, I want you to know something. Being underestimated doesn't mean you're weak. It often means someone else is counting on your silence to keep their power intact. And silence, when chosen deliberately, can also be a weapon. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe you've experienced something similar, or maybe you're just beginning to question a situation that hasn't felt right for a long time. Share in the comments if you feel comfortable. You're not as alone as you might think. And if you want to stay with me for more stories about standing your ground, reclaiming your voice, and watching the tables turn when patience meets truth, make sure you're subscribed. There are more stories ahead, and you're always welcome here.